And great. Okay. So this first half's going to last about 40 minutes or so. There's a couple of videos in here I haven't used before, so I'm not completely sure how the runtime will go, but it'll be somewhere 35 to 40 minutes in is what I imagine. And this talk is built on other talks we've done, and it primarily is built on some of the questions we get asked typically when we give talks, and expanding on some of those. And the very, very first question that typically comes up is, where do you get your ideas from? And it's without being silly about alcohol and having a slightly skewed brain and stuff, it's actually quite a difficult question to answer, because there's a sort of reciprocal thing that goes on, in that the more techniques I learn, say in Photoshop, the more I get an idea about how that technique might make an image. So it's not a fixed quantity of ideas versus processing. There's all kinds of places we get ideas from. And I'm just, there's a list: myths and legends, paintings, poetry, literature, song titles and lyrics. And I've put that especially abstract thing there just to remind me to say something when I get to song titles and lyrics. Movies, DVD posters, museum displays, computer games, cartoons, book covers, art, items on cocktail menus, everything, everywhere. Rather than go through that list item by item, I'm going to dip into it and share with you some examples from some but not all of those categories. And almost immediately, there's an idea of planning versus spontaneity. And people sometimes say, when you go on a photo shoot, or when you organize a photo shoot, do you have clear plans in your heads about the kind of images that you want to take before you take them? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, we find that we often get more out of a photo shoot if we've sat quietly and said, what kind of images do we want to get from this shoot? That can go sometimes to making little pen stick drawings of people standing together. So we might have, for instance, an image from a few years ago that has somebody facing in a particular direction. I might go on a photo shoot tomorrow and say, I've remembered that shot. I want to shoot somebody in the opposite direction, maybe looking backwards. We'll come to that. From today, so that I'll be able to put it into that one that I've taken a while ago. So I do review my own photographs in my own archive and deliberately think, oh, I need another photograph soon to go with that one because I'd forgotten I had that one, and so on. So there is a degree of planning for sure. But then it becomes very spontaneous and very flexible on the day. And we will often deviate from, maybe more than you. I'll often have a whole lot of ideas, and then on the day have a whole lot of new ones, and deviate from my original plan. Sharon's a little bit more systematic. I think she does both. She makes sure she gets the ones that she came for and then gets flexible afterwards. But that's the answer is to the question, is it planned or is it spontaneous? It's both. Okay. Now, just back to that list. Cocktail menus. How on earth can you get an inspiration from a cocktail menu? Well, we were sitting in a cocktail bar. That sounds like a song, doesn't it? And one of the items on the list was a long screw against a wall. And I thought, I bet you I could make a funny photograph out of that. And this is it. So the original photograph of Bethany was a kind of one of those experiments. I do lots of experiments with light. And I wondered what would happen with this model if I moved the light behind her and shot it downwards. It's not a very flattering photograph to shoot someone at that angle. And it was quite a harsh speed light. So I had it for ages. And then I got this idea. So that's a Hornby train set gable end of a little plastic model. And that's a screw. It's not easy to photograph a screw and get it in focus. It's actually highly focused at that. And it's pulled all together, and it's just a joke, a long screw against the wall. Just be thankful I'm not showing you my version of
No.
Sex on the Beach. Okay. Song lyrics, lots and lots. And in general, the point, my reminder about abstract is sometimes I do listen to song lyrics. I like poetry. I like the lyricism of songs. And sometimes the more abstract, the better. So, you know, Lady in Red, that's really hard to write, to make an image that doesn't include somebody in a red dress. Also, a judge once said, don't use that title because everyone uses it. But I'm just making up a lyric now. Fleetwood Mac, Dreams. One of the lyrics in that is the stillness of remembering. That would make a very interesting prompt for an image because it's abstract. So if I was to give out a piece of advice, if you're going to go for song lyrics, actually don't think literal, but think more abstract. And I think it might spark imagination. Here's one example. I'm a kind of 70s rocker in terms of my interest in music, and Parisian Walkways by Gary Moore. Because I'm from Dublin, I was big into Thin Lizzy and Gary Moore when I was younger. And I remember Paris in '49, the Champs-Élysées, Saint-Michel and Old Beaujolais wine, and I recall that you were mine in those Parisian days. If you know the song, it's got one of the best guitar riffs going. So 2 lyrics there. I remember Paris. Can you make an image from that lyric? And in those Parisian days, can you make an image from that lyric? So what happens if you try? That's I Remember Paris. A bit of a Marmite photograph. It's got quite a few acceptances in salons, but it's also been rejected many times in salons. And I think if I was to criticize it myself and ask why, it's because judges don't like a significant portion of an image being out of focus. And were I to do that again, I would make sure that that's April, isn't it? The model April. Yeah. That April was in focus on the back as well as her reflection being in focus. She was actually looking into a mirror when I took that. I hadn't planned the shot then. Had I planned it, I would have made sure I had 2 separate images, one where her back was in focus, one where the reflection was in focus, and I would have melded them together in Photoshop. So that's okay. It hasn't done particularly well. In those Parisian days, however, is one of my most successful monos. It's got me a bunch of awards. It's got a couple of gold medals. People seem to really like it. For instance, it was put on the front of the Midland International Salon brochure a few years ago. It just happens to have done very well for me. 2 lyrics from the same verse in a song, both having a go, not knowing in advance which would do well. One of them's done well, one of them hasn't done well. So lyrics. I've also got literature, but I'm going to come back to literature later. Poetry. I really like poetry. I'm quite into poetry. Dylan Thomas from Wales. This poem, people probably know it. It's about when we become aware of our own mortality, we shouldn't just quietly go to the grave uncomplainingly. We should rage about it. We should fight it. And this was about his dad and his grief about his dad's departure. Back to the abstract. In my mind, when I think about this lyric, I think about a whole bunch of people just going to the distance uncomplainingly, and one person going, I'm not having that. There's got to be a way to fight this. So those are abstract ideas. That's the image I came up with in response to that abstract lyric. A whole lot of people just quietly going to the end, and one woman going, I'm not having this, and one guy going, something's up. This is not the way you're supposed to do it. Just that as an abstract concept. DVD covers. Now, here's the bit where I kind of slightly embarrassingly admit in front of Sharon that as a young man, I had a bit of a thing for the Danish model Helena Christensen. She represented something in my psyche about womanhood that I found deeply attractive. It's okay, love, I'm over it now. There was a famous YouTube video, not a YouTube, it's on YouTube, a video from the shoot that she did with Chris Isaak for the music from Wicked Game, the official video from Wicked Game. If you don't know it, just Google Wicked Game and Helena Christensen, and you'll see this really beautiful, slightly erotic, but you can't see anything kind of video. And I loved that. I thought, I'm going to make a photograph as a tribute to that kind of beach scene between the two of them. And what I came up with was this image. And again, this has been quite successful for me. The young model there, we met her in a Costa coffee shop in Colwyn Bay during a 1940s reenactment. And that's her boss from the coffee shop, who knew her really, really well.
They were best friends.
They're best friends. They're not lovers. They're not naked, by the way, either. They just look naked. They disported themselves very appropriately. Darren's gay, she isn't, so they managed to look very, very intimate, and yet they were just best friends and got on really well together. We did loads and loads and loads of shoots with them, and lovely. The reason I'm showing you this in particular is one of the things that often happens is, when you get discussions about, is everyone is influenced by everyone else's ideas, and so they should be, and they have been from the history of art. There is a fine line between being very influenced by somebody and actually copying their work. And where you draw that line is very hard to describe precisely. When they were in our house and we were discussing poses, I got down a DVD cover, a DVD from our shelves, The Time Traveler's Wife. And I said, can you pose kind of like that? They did such a good job. If I spin that, it almost looks like I completely copied that DVD for that image. If I go back and show it to you, it's really close. It wasn't intentional, but actually that's as close as I would feel comfortable going to make an image looking like another one. Now, later on, we'll copy an image deliberately, but that's for training purposes, as I will explain. That's about as close as I would feel comfortable going to someone else's artwork without feeling that I was actually plagiarizing. And it was kind of a coincidence, just because those two looked at the DVD and just melded themselves into that pose, which looked great. Museum displays. The Jeffrey Museum of the Home in London. Now, if you go there, it's no longer called the Jeffrey Museum. Quite appropriately, people looked at the history of that guy, Jeffrey, as a slave trader and said, we're not having his name in our museum. So it's the Museum of the Home now. But when I took these photographs, it was called the Jeffrey Museum of the Home in London. And this is just photographs of some of the room displays in the museum. And one of them in particular, this 18th century parlor, I took. And I had that. And afterwards, I thought it would be really nice if somebody was in that room. And I remembered a shoot with Ivory Flame, Holly, that I'd done a couple of years previously. And in particular, this shot of her sitting in a chair. And I thought that would look really nice combined with that other image. So I popped her in the image. And if you like, the clever bits are the shadows. The clever bits are working out where the shadow would fall here if that chair was there, and particularly its density. I do spend a lot of time thinking about shadows. I'm very nerdy, and making sure the shadows here worked for that image. It worked well and did well for me in color. It did particularly, and does particularly well for me in mono. And that is an idea that was inspired by a room, a fortuitous shoot in a museum. Cartoons. Now, it seems like an odd thing to say, that you can be inspired by cartoons, but I'll just show you in sequence just a few images here, just two or three. That's the philosopher. That's inspiration. That's the scholar. All three of those were inspired by a single cartoon I saw in a graphic art book. That's the cartoon. We underestimate the skill that cartoonists have frequently. If you look at that, look at the use of light and shade, look at the use of color, look at the use of how the rendering of the back of that room is slightly out of focus in relation to the sharp drawing lines in the books and the philosopher's eyes and so on. So I look at images quite a lot. I look at graphic art quite a lot for inspiration. And as I say, some of the inspirations for me are literally cartoons. Computer games. That's an interesting thing. I'm not that into computer games, but my grandkids are, and my kids were. That's Warhammer. And I've often looked at that. I would love to do a photographic rendition of something like that. But how on earth would I even begin it? And that's perhaps an example of where you might build up images over a long, long period of time before you get somewhere. I was on a Viking shoot a few years ago in Derby, and the guys who were dressed up as Vikings, as part of the shoot, I said to each time I had a session with one of them, we were divided all day shooting different people. I said, can you imagine you're being attacked from the sky by a dragon, and will you do a pose, please? People were going, what? And different people, I had that idea in mind, different poses. Both of those, I'm going to talk about dynamic movement in a bit, but both of those lack a kind of dynamism. Whereas this lovely lady managed to get a beautiful dynamic pose. And I said to her, imagine you're being attacked from the sky by a demon. Okay. And I have that in an archive. It's not going, I can't do anything with it for a while, but it's there. Okay. Two more sources in detail: book cover art and graphic novels and art drawing books. That is a cover of a book that we like, this kind of fantasy stuff. It would be very easy. I haven't done a copy of this. I probably should do. I haven't done a photographic print. It would be very easy to do that. Certainly living around here, we got castles, we got lakes. There's mist. We'll come back to mist. There's forests and there's models. It would be very, very easy to do that. Shooting models from the back is a tip that we frequently give. When you're going in a model shoot, don't just shoot the model from the front. Lots and lots of useful composites can be made if you shoot a model from the back and from the side. It would be comparatively easy for us to make an image like that. And the inspiration would be simply the cover of a book. While I'm on book covers, that's a random sample of books that I just took off Amazon recently. And what they have in common is the model has their back to the camera, or to the artist, if you like. We would very strongly, I think both of us would really endorse this, very strongly recommend that you shoot people from the back. It makes a very good narrative when you have a conversation going on, a story, if you like, in a composite. If you take the one on the bottom right, sorry,
I was just going to say, the models do look at you a bit strangely when you say, I want to take it from the back.
Yeah, I'm trying to say I want to see your best side or anything, but yeah, they're not used to posing from the back. But we almost without exception would say every single photo shoot we go on, we make sure we shoot models from the back and the side and so on. So for instance, if we were going to make, my own Zoom is in the way here, I'm just going to collapse my Zoom for a second. This one on the right, bottom right here, that would make a lovely image. I haven't tried it yet. I might well do, but obviously to do it, I would need two models, neither of whom are looking at the camera. So that's just another tip. Shoot models from all directions. Whoops. Art books. I grew up with this Frank Frazetta book. I had it since I was an adolescent and lusting after Helena Christensen. I also, you couldn't get that much stuff in Dublin when I was growing up. So, we took what we got. But for instance, that's one of the paintings Frazetta made in the 70s. And that inspired this photograph. The spider there is a fascinator. It's not a Halloween hat. And I said to Sharon's very creative. I said, I need to get this upside down spider idea, and I need it fixed in some kind of liquid, and I don't know what to do. And Sharon immediately said, green jelly. Absolutely brilliant idea. So we made some green jelly, stuck the hat upside down in it and waited for it to set. I had this photograph of, that's actually a photographer from a shoot I was on, who was a bodybuilder. And I ended up, the best image I got from the whole day was one of the other photographers. And I knew in my head, again, preparation, I knew I had this idea. So I just got him to hold a stick, and as if he was stabbing down, and the rest was post-processed in. It's called arachnophobia. There's another one, that's the back of that book. The idea of someone being chained and a spider there. I haven't made it yet, but my mate James in our home posed for that. That is one day going to be a Franz Frazetta inspired composite. with a snake in it somehow. I definitely believe you should have more ideas than time. So there are not hundreds, but tens of projects waiting somewhere in a folder for the next bit of the image. If I'm ever somewhere where I can get a snake with enough detail to put it in there, the snake's going in there. Art books, that's a book on art, drawing and posing. And sometimes we go to a photo shoot with those ideas either photographed on our iPhone or just drawn ourselves. So that page from an artist's drawing book led to that photograph in a studio. And she, Kelsey, I've forgotten her name, Kelsey, is going to be in an image sometime in the future where I build up the background to fit with the narrative I want to make. So some quick shooty tips. One of the first things is people say, have you any tips for equipment I might buy that might be useful? My best tip, if you wanted to spend less than 25 quid on any one item, I'm quite into lighting. I do a lot of, I'm trying to study lighting as much as I can. I would recommend the following piece of kit. It's a video conference lighting kit. And I bought it on Amazon. I'm going to just change it. Basically, before I change this slide, it goes from very bright, from very pale, well, that's not the word I'm after, very orange light, 3000 Kelvin or so, down to quite Arctic blue light, about 6200 Kelvin. Just by turning a dial, and you can increase the intensity of the light. The brand is Oh Hotter, if you want to write that down in case you want to go after it. The price there, I looked at this yesterday. Yesterday's price on Amazon was just over 23 quid. I've bought a bunch of these. I find them really, really useful. Because
they stack on
They stack on top of each other. You can combine them together. They're just a great piece of kit. Great for still life, great for model shooting. I don't mean models as in small things, not females. Not all models are females, Robert. Oh Hotter, worth going after if you're interested. That's Emma lit by an Oh Hotter light in a lantern. I'll talk about candlelight in a bit in more detail, but that's an example of the lighting effect you can get from just one of those. My ISO there was 1000, by the way, so there's a tiny bit of digital noise in it, but not much. We shoot on the Sony mirrorless, and it's the full frame is very, very forgiving of noise. That's a hand puppet for the kids of a dinosaur head. And I couldn't find the Amazon link when I looked for it yesterday, but just a really useful thing to have. We look for all kinds of stuff like that. Eye gaze. When we're posing, we often will have different people together in a composite that never actually met each other. That one there is ready for pasting into a kind of Tudory background when I get round to it. But those models never met each other. That's Louisa from Prenton Camera Club. And Sharon is sitting on the seat there to give Louisa somewhere to direct her eye gaze. I know that the model who's coming, Natalie, is the same height. Natalie is the same height as Sharon. So when Sharon sits on that seat and Louisa looks at her, Louisa is the same eye gaze that Louisa has is going to fit Natalie on that chair because she's the same size as Sharon. So we get that. They've never met. They were never in the same room at the same time. But if I simply said to Louisa, can you gaze downwards? Her eye gaze would miss the point where Natalie's eye is going to end up. So that works. So directing eye gaze is just another tip for composites. Dynamism, being dynamic. I have bored people previously in other talks with my version of The Last Supper, where I got everyone to dress up as gangsters. All of those people were shot. Well, I was going to say all of those people were shot individually. They kind of were, but the point I want to make is if you shoot, my learning from this big composite was if I ever want to shoot a group of people together, I'm not going to shoot them as individuals and then combine them, because it's a bit too static. It's lacking in dynamism. What I mean by that is, this is a section of the original from the Milan wall of the refectory where Da Vinci painted his Last Supper. And that's James in the orange, leaning across the back of the Apostle Andrew to touch the back of Peter. Now, if you shoot that as an individual shot, it looks like that. So that was my instruction. This is my mate Roger. That was my instruction to Roger. Lean across the back of somebody as if you're touching the arm of somebody else. And it doesn't have any life in it. It doesn't have any movement, no dynamic. I had to reshoot it. That's reshooting it. These are all photographers locally. But look at the difference in dynamism by simply posing people together. Sharon will later be edited out of that image and somebody else will be put in there. But it allows me to have that movement in a static image that is not possible shooting on its own. That's another one. I'm there. You can see the remote control in my hand. They're members of Conway Camera Club. Because there's more than one person interacting together, you get a much more dynamic, much more alive kind of movement. So that's what I wanted to do. And the final point we made earlier, shoot from all angles. This is us with Danny. You'll see Danny later in Sharon's talk. That would be normally how I would shoot a model, how most people would shoot a model. What we do differently is we get the model to turn their body by about 30 degrees. So what I did with Danny, do at every photo shoot, is the following. That one, 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 and that one. Back again. I can now use each one of those in individual composites and it works really well. The fire breathing shoot. I want to share this with you because it was possibly the most technical shoot we did. And what I mean by that is we got a message from somebody called Kaylee, a model called Kaylee, saying, would you shoot me breathing fire? If you look up fire breathing shots, they're really hard to get right. You either expose for the flame to get the detail of all the flame. And if you do that, it's so bright, the model's face and body is too dark. If you expose for the model's face and body, the flame bleaches out. And it's really hard to get those, the two right. What we learned, or what I learned by going on YouTube a lot, is if you're going to do that, you're going to have to use high-speed sync for off-camera flash. What that means is we normally, if the difference between, apologies for teaching grannies to suck eggs now for the next minute. Most people I'm sure will know this. Once you start using studio lights, you can't use your exposure triangle the way you normally do in daylight. The light falling on the model's face is determined solely by the aperture. You can't make it darker by increasing your shutter speed. What you do if you do that is you make the ambient light darker and you immediately run into the problem of your sync speed, usually around 1/200. If you try and go faster, you start getting those dreaded curtains, the black curtains that come in. The way around that, if your camera will do it and your flash will do it, is to use something called high-speed sync, where you can increase your shutter speeds dramatically. And what that does is it darkens the background. Our challenge for an image like this is I need the shutter speed to expose for the flame, and I need the aperture separately to expose for Kaylee's face and body. And they have to be independently manipulable. So I need to go higher than 1/200. So I have to use a shutter speed of 1/200. So I have to use high-speed sync. And then the only variable I have for overall brightness or darkness is ISO. So we worked this out in advance of the shoot. And you can just see Sharon's face there holding the rotolite on a stick, on a bar, to light her. The lighting for the flame was somewhere between 1/400, 1/600. It varied during the shoot. The aperture was 6.3 to give us enough light falling on Kaylee and enough depth of field. And the ISO was about 640. And we basically just had great fun shooting. That's me holding the light for Sharon. Kaylee came with Dylan from Baden Film Horses, and we didn't realize this was happening. It was really useful. Dylan was shooting on his iPhone behind the scenes. So that's Conway Beach. It was really cold, almost exactly a year ago. That's what the shot looked like from an iPhone. But coincidentally, he took this almost at the same second as Sharon was shooting on her camera with high-speed sync. That's what it looks like using high-speed sync. So the ambient light is completely killed by the high shutter speed. And if I go back between those, you can see how close they are in time. That's an example of how high-speed sync can really help. And we just got loads and loads of really useful, really nice images. That's another one of Dylan's. If we were ever doing this again, cover your equipment with a plastic see-through bag, because that's liquid paraffin. Our equipment stank of liquid paraffin for weeks and weeks and weeks afterwards. And I probably could have set it on fire as well. So, you know, health and safety, we'll worry about that afterwards. But we got some lovely, lovely shots using that kind of lighting. I also brought down some demon masks and a couple of cloaks because I was into a phase of shooting demons, and fair play to them in the cold, they dressed up, and I got a couple of shots like this that are going to appear in demon shots at some later stage. All things come from to those who wait, because I now can complete Warhammer because I've got that. Remember that? Remember that? Remember that? And I can get this. It's okay. It's still maybe the dragon looks a little bit plastic, a little bit unrealistic, but that's the kind of example of building stuff up. Okay, now I'm going to do something slightly more specific and talk about inspiration from the Dutch Renaissance. So I'm going to stop here and show you a video. And I'm not going to talk because I can't multitask. That's not it. I think I just closed the video. I did. I'm going to have to retrieve this video because I just closed it rather than opened it. I'm in control here. I know what I'm doing. Share screen, movie, share.
Yay.
Okay. This is about my inspiration. I take a lot of inspiration from paintings, and in particular, the Dutch Golden Age, as you will see. So I'm just going to, it's self-explanatory. I'm just going to let this video go. It runs for about 5.5 minutes. By the way, that's the photograph of the woman holding the Ohotter light in the lantern with a little bit of post-processing to make that a candle. So again, my plug for, I'm not paid by Ohotter, by the way, in the slightest, or by Amazon, but just it shows you what you can do creatively with lighting if you've got a slow enough shutter speed and a high enough ISO. Okay, I'll let this run. As I've mentioned in previous talks, I study paintings in a lot of detail and try to find inspiration for my photography from the works of the old masters. Many hundreds of years ago, these extremely talented painters struggled with many of the same issues that are common to today's photographers. How to render a three-dimensional view into 2 dimensions, how to use perspective and colour to direct the viewer's eye, and how to take inspiration from those who went before them while using their own creativity to build something novel into this body of work rather than just copy it. In particular, I try to study the techniques they use for capturing light and shade, and for this reason I'm particularly drawn to the old masters from the Dutch Renaissance period, which ran from about 1600 onwards for about a century. I'm also interested in painters who were themselves influenced by the Dutch Golden Age, and how they carried on the traditions introduced by such masters as Rembrandt, Vermeer and Caravaggio. For example, in the 1800s, the Dutch artist Petrus van Schendel painted a whole series of images of night markets around The Hague Antwerp, Amsterdam, and Brussels. The influence of the earlier masters is clear in his depiction of subjects lit from a candle in the foreground. What he sometimes added was a secondary light source from the sky, and in his paintings he often used a colour palette that emphasised colours that were opposite on the colour wheel, in particular orange for the flame and blue for the moonlight. I took inspiration from his work for elements of my own image called the Night Watchman. The initial inspiration for this image didn't come directly from a painting, however, but from a famous quotation from George Orwell. "We sleep soundly in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to visit violence on those who would do us harm." This image depicts the last rounds of a watchman securing a wealthy family's house for the night. There is just enough blue light in the sky to tell us that this is late evening, and there is also a hint of moonlight from the lighter grey-blue colour falling on the left side of the watchman's face, the edge of his fingers, and the top of the lantern. This contrasts with the orange light from the candle illuminating the right side of his face and concentrating our gaze on his right eye. In Orwell's terms, this is not a man to be messed with. Once again, I'm trying to be influenced by, rather than directly copy, the work of those artists I admire, but the influence of Van Schendel can clearly be seen in this composite. Some people criticised Van Schendel for the fact that he seemed to make his entire career painting more or less the same image with slight variations, but I don't think that is fair. In fact, he produced many excellent paintings that weren't based on night markets. But if I do have a single criticism of his work, it's that he captured candlelight so well that sometimes his light sources themselves become the most dominant feature of the image. As a viewer of his paintings, I'm often initially drawn more strongly to the candle itself than to the people's faces, as he tends to make the candle flame the brightest part of the image. This seems an odd thing to do, as this issue was well known to the artists of the Dutch Golden Age a good 200 years before Van Schendel was producing his images. Including a light source in an image was something of a fashion during the Dutch Renaissance period, and was used as a way of showing off the difficult artistic skill of reproducing flame using pigment. But these earlier artists had a dilemma. They wanted to draw the viewer's eye to the faces in their images and have the light source as an important but incidental element of the paintings. To do this, they worked out two quite specific artistic tricks. The first technique involves covering the candle or light source within the image. The viewer can see that there is a candle in the image, but the source of the light is partially covered. This allows the artist to brightly light the part of the image that should be the focus of the viewer's gaze, while still showing the artistic skill of using pigment to represent flame. The second technique is to fully show the candle in the painting, but to deliberately lower the brightness of the flame itself and make the face brighter than the actual light source. This is clear artistic license. In reality, the light source will always be the brightest part of an image. But the artists of the period adopted a convention of deciding in advance what should be the focus of the viewer's gaze and making that the brightest part. Once these techniques are pointed out, they are actually quite obvious. But for many years I hadn't noticed them, even in paintings that I'd been looking at for ages. It was only when I attempted to try my own photographic versions of these images that I realized how hard it was to control light and shade when depicting a visible flame within an image. We'll finish the video here, and I'll now show you some more of my images that were inspired by this awareness of 400-year-old artistic techniques. Okay, I've just realized I'm going to maybe go 5 minutes over what I thought I would. Probably going to finish just about 20 past 11. So I think that's okay, but I'm going to have one more video and before it a quick PowerPoint, but I'll speed through the PowerPoint a little bit quicker than I had intended to.
There's absolutely no problem, Rob. It's more your time than our time, I think.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't want to eat into Sharon's half because I'll get killed.
You're blabbering too
I'm
much.
blabbering too much, my darling. So here's my use of my learning from that video in my own images. So the first is the use of the hidden light source. So again, I don't copy things exactly. I try and do my own interpretation of them. But if you look at the hands in front of that candle, what a lovely idea, what a lovely way of blocking the light. And that led to this image of mine in the crypt, I've called it, just to try and get the same kind of effect. She was originally holding a speed light, and then I replaced the speed light with a candle afterwards. There, the light is hidden, and the book is hiding a speed light. Again, I think that's a bit too bright. If I was doing that again, I would lower that light a bit more. That's one that's done particularly well for me. There, the light, there's ambient light is studio lighting, but the actual light source is a torch hidden inside the book. And then that is what's lighting her face. Reducing the brightness of the candle, the other technique, probably more frequently used by the artist and by me. That's the beautiful Georgia. She's 14. You will meet her a lot today.
She's in this.
We were just looking at both of our talks in advance last night, and Georgia features hugely in Sharon's as well as mine. So you'll see Georgia a lot. You'll also see her in a video in a second before I finish. So you can see what I'm doing here photographically. I'm reducing the power of the light by using post-processing techniques. That's a similar technique to the one a similar photograph to the one I showed you earlier with the night watchman. And again, now that I pointed out, you can see that candle is much lower in intensity than it would be if it was actually throwing that light onto James's face, and so on. So that's the technique. I said when I showed you I Remember Paris that the next time I was shooting something in a mirror, I'd try and make sure the model was in focus in the front. So there we are. And this last one, this is George's big sister Paige. Again, they both live locally. And this is just me showing off. I'm using both techniques here at the same time. I've got a candle with reduced flame, and I've got a candle that's hidden behind a book. So I'm doing both. So what we're going to do in the final video is, what I'd love to be able to do is say, come to our studio at home and I'll show you how we do a talk, how we do a shoot. So at this talk, that's what I'm going to do. By the powers vested in me by Zoom and video, I'm going to invite you to our home studio with me to reproduce this image. It's going to be in two parts. I'm going to try and reproduce it exactly. I said I don't do that other than for training, to train myself. So we're going to try and reproduce this exactly, but I'm never going to use it because it'll be too close to the original. And then a second shoot, I'm going to move it around and be a bit more creative with it. And I might well use that second shoot in salons or exhibitions or whatever. This is us at home. That's our sitting room. The studio is that very, very small area at the back of the couch there. We move the stuff out of the way, and that's the space. So this video I'm about to show you takes place in that space. It's a small space, but we use it very creatively. And the only prop, the main prop in there, is a wooden table that I made by using scraps of wood that I combined together in the garden one sunny day. Right, so I shall stop sharing there and open the final video. And this time I will actually concentrate, honestly. Close PowerPoint, open video, go back to Zoom. This is called self-instruction. Share video, QuickTime player, play. Here we go. So welcome to our home studio as part of a shoot. This is supposed to feel like you're actually here and you're doing the shoot with me. This is the basic setup for the Girl with Candle shoot. Here's the parchment that she's going to be reading. It's just a crumpled up piece of paper. Here's the candle. It's going to be lit and then it's going to not be lit at various stages in the shoot. And that yellow dot allows me to precisely place it back in the same position if I have to remove it. I'm expecting to have to remove it because it's going to be lit by a flash, and if I leave it there and shoot with the flash, the shadow of this is going to go in front of the girl's face, so I need to remove it when I'm using the flash. This is the flash I'm going to use, standard speed light. It's a Nikon SB90 910. This nice gadget clips over the top and allows a magnet to put a grid to narrow the field of the light. And here's a little DIY Rob gadget. This is a piece of orange gel with some insulating tape wound around either side to give a nice little narrow band of light. When that's combined with the grid, what I'm hoping for is the narrow light will be about that wide, replicating the light that would normally come from a candle. So that's the basic setup. If I pull back and show you the position of the camera, we can see the Sony on a tripod, and this won't change during the entire shoot. I'm using a 55mm prime lens, and I'm going to stop down to 7.1 as I need to maximize the depth of field in order to keep both the candle and the model sharp. I've set the ISO to 640, but even with this setting, I know I'll need some very slow shutter speeds to gather in the light, so I'm making sure to use a remote shutter release to minimize any camera shake. The first stage in the shoot is lighting the model, just with the candle. So let's get started by introducing you to her. Okay, here we are in the first stages of getting ready for the shoot. So this is the lovely Kitty. Hello, Kitty. This is the wonderful stylist, Sharon Prenton Jones. And we're doing the very first shoot, which is going to be where Kitty is illuminated just with the natural candlelight. So we'll do that in a second. As predicted, exposing for the candle flame itself leaves Kitty almost completely in the dark. The settings here are shutter speeds of 1/50, f7.1 and ISO 640. Dropping the shutter speed to 1/3 of a second to expose for Kitty's face causes the candle flame to bleach out and becomes the brightest part of the image, and also introduces so much ambient light that the overall effect is flat and boring. Note to self, don't try a shot like this in the afternoon. I need to wait until it's completely dark if I want to rely on candlelight alone. Instead of just relying on candlelight, I can use the speed light to illuminate Kitty and then add the candle in afterwards. My first attempt immediately throws up two problems. Firstly, there's a strong, ugly shadow on the right side of her nose, so I'll ask her to change her position to face squarely onto the light. Secondly, even though I deliberately chose not to use a white parchment for her to read, it is still bleaching out in this shot, so I'm going to ask her to lower the letter onto the table surface to allow the light to hit it less directly. These changes work better, but despite my attempts to get the flash to illuminate just a narrow strip, there's too much light on the table itself. The first step in post-processing is therefore to darken this before adding a separate shot of the candlestick taken without any flame. Then I can add the separate exposure of the flame taken earlier. Having this on its own layer allows me to precisely determine how bright it should be, just as Santerre did in his painting. The final step is to flatten the image and add a duplicate layer with a different white balance. Having this on its own layer allows me to use the opacity slider to decide what color balance looks best in the final image. Maybe about here. Looking at the cropped final version, I'm fairly happy with it as a reproduction of the Santerre original, but I don't like the fact that I can't see the top of the model's head, as her dark hair disappears into the black background above her. Although this was also true in the original painting, I think the composition would look better with some headgear that would help avoid this happening. I therefore know what I want to do in a reshoot of this image, and I also have a wild ambition to see if I can do something different with the lighting. 2 days later, we were joined by a different model, Georgia, so let's meet her. And here we are getting ready for the shot. This is the lovely Georgia. Hello, Georgia.
Hello.
Georgia is going to be our model this evening, and she is being styled by the lovely Sharon Prenton Jones, who's taking care of the headgear.
which we purchased in Halfords. That's lovely. Okay, we shall discuss how to light this now. Can you move slightly over to your left with the chair as well? Okay. And what I'm trying to do, here's a flash gun. I'm trying to make sure the flash gun and the candle are in the same line going to your face. So can you adjust yourself? That's it, with the seat as well, because that's what I'm after. Okay. The best way to check the alignment is to fire the flash, leaving the candlestick in place. This confirms that everything is lined up correctly and also gives me my first glimpse of the headgear, and all seems to be well. This time, however, in addition to taking some speedlight images, I set myself the challenge to see if I could light the image solely with candlelight. Building on what I learned from the first attempt with Kitty, I opened the aperture to f3.5. Knowing that I was going to add the candle in afterwards allowed me a slightly narrower depth of field. Asking Georgia to stay as still as possible, I set the shutter initially to 1/8 of a second and then gradually slowed the shutter speed even further. This is 1/6 of a second. This is 1/5. This is 1/3 of a second. And finally, 1/2 a second. Full marks to Georgia for holding so still for that length of time. I have now gone as slow as I dare and have managed to capture an exposure lit only with the light from a single candle. I will use this as my base image and will post-process it in exactly the same way as shown previously with Kitty. This is the final result, and I'm pleased with my first ever image lit from a single candle flame.
Okay, and that's me done. So I'll hand back over to you, Suzanne, but I think we'll just have a break now, if that suits. Let people chat to each other. While we're having the break, we will mute ourselves and turn off our video because we need to swap around from all the material that's on this computer from my talk to all the material from Sharon's talk.